I went on a solo writing retreat in the woods, and I'm still shaken by what happened there. This happened last year, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately and decided to share it. I'm a writer, nothing famous or anything, just someone who freelances and works on personal projects when I can. A lot of my work happens at home, but it can get pretty distracting, especially living in Chicago. It's noisy, there's always something going on, and I just needed a break. So I thought a little solo writing retreat would help me focus. I found this remote cabin on Airbnb in northern Michigan, not too far from Traverse City. It seemed perfect. No internet, no cell service, just me, my laptop, and nature. The host had great reviews and described it as a cozy, peaceful place for anyone wanting to disconnect and recharge. The pictures showed a simple but nice cabin surrounded by dense woods, and that was exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 5 days. The drive up was fine, and I was actually excited about spending some time by myself, away from everything. When I got there, the host was waiting for me at the cabin. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 50s, early 60s. He seemed friendly enough, though a little overly enthusiastic about the seclusion aspect of the place. He kept repeating how remote the area was and how I wouldn't see anyone for miles. I guess it was meant to be reassuring, but I started to feel a bit weird about how much he emphasized that I was alone. The cabin itself was exactly like the pictures. Small, clean, and tucked away in the woods. It had a basic setup. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a living room with a wood stove, and a landline phone for emergencies, since there was no cell service. The nearest town was about a 40-minute drive, and I figured if I needed anything, I could just make a trip down there. The first night was pretty uneventful. I spent some time setting up, made a quick dinner, and started working on my writing. The silence was actually kind of nice, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the cabin settling. I went to bed early, feeling pretty good about the whole thing. The second night is when things started to get strange. I was sitting at the small table in the kitchen working on my laptop when I heard this knock at the door. It startled me because, like I said, this place was in the middle of nowhere. The host had made a point of saying there were no other cabins or houses nearby, and I hadn't seen anyone on my drive up here. It was already dark out, and the only light came from the lamp in the kitchen and the faint glow of the wood stove. I didn't know what to do at first. I thought maybe it was the host, but why would he come back? I got up, walked to the door, and peered out through the window, but I couldn't see anyone. The porch light wasn't on, and it was pitch black outside. My heart was pounding, and I stood there for a minute, just listening. There was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, or maybe even a tree branch hitting the side of the cabin, so I went back to my work. But about 20 minutes later, there was another knock. This time it was softer, more like a tapping than a knock. Again, I went to the door, but there was no one there. I was starting to get freaked out, so I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure they were all shut. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise had me on edge, but by the time morning came, I convinced myself I was just overreacting. It was a strange place, and I wasn't used to being that isolated. Maybe I was imagining things. The next day, I decided to take a walk in the woods to clear my head. The weather was nice, and it felt good to get some fresh air after being cooped up inside. I followed a path behind the cabin that led into the forest. It was peaceful, and I started to feel better about being there. I walked for about an hour before turning around and heading back. When I got back to the cabin, though, something felt off. It was hard to explain, but it was like the air inside had changed, like someone had been in there while I was gone. I checked the door and it was still locked, exactly how I left it. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to my writing, but I couldn't focus. That evening I decided to go to bed early. I figured if I just got some sleep, I'd feel better in the morning. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of tapping again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window in the bedroom. The window was directly across from the bed, and I could see the silhouette of trees against the night sky. But as I sat up, I saw something move outside. It was faint, just a shadow, or maybe a trick of the light, but I could swear I saw someone standing just beyond the trees, looking toward the cabin. My heart was racing and I froze, just staring at the window, trying to figure out what I was seeing. But then, just as quickly as I thought I saw it, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, listening for any more sounds, but the rest of the night was quiet. When the sun finally came up, I felt exhausted and anxious, but I convinced myself that I had to finish out the trip. I had 2 more days left, and I didn't want to leave early. I told myself that it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Being out there alone in the dark with no cell service was getting to me. The next day, I tried to keep myself busy. I wrote for a few hours, went for another walk, and even made a trip into town to grab some groceries. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The landline phone in the kitchen, the one I hadn't touched since I got there, was off the hook. It was just sitting there, dangling off the counter. I stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if maybe I'd knocked it over by accident. But I was sure I hadn't. I put the phone back on the hook, feeling a pit in my stomach. I was definitely starting to feel paranoid, but I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. That night was my last at the cabin, and I couldn't wait to leave in the morning. I tried to go to bed early again, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept thinking about the phone being off the hook, the tapping at the window, the figure in the trees. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise outside the cabin. This time, it wasn't a knock or tapping. It was the sound of footsteps, crunching leaves and twigs just outside the front door. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart pounding, listening as the footsteps slowly circled the cabin. They stopped outside the bedroom window. I couldn't breathe. I was too scared to move, too scared to even look at the window. The footsteps stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then slowly, they moved away, back around the cabin, and disappeared into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as it was light out, I packed up my stuff, threw everything into the car, and left. I didn't even bother cleaning up or checking out with the host. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. On the drive back to Chicago, I kept replaying everything in my head. I wondered if maybe it was just a local messing with me, or if it was the host trying to scare me for some reason. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I'd narrowly avoided something really bad happening. When I got home, I went straight to bed, trying to put the whole experience behind me. A few days later, I was browsing online, looking up the area around where the cabin was located, and I stumbled across something that made my stomach drop. A woman had gone missing in the same area about a year before I stayed there. Her car had been found near one of the hiking trails, but she was never found. The article didn't mention anything about the cabin I stayed at, but knowing that someone had disappeared so close to where I was made the whole experience feel even more unsettling. I never reported what happened. I don't know if anyone would have believed me or if there was even anything to report. But I haven't gone on a solo retreat since, and I doubt I ever will again. Something about that place just didn't feel right, and even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl. We rented a historic house for a weekend getaway, but we weren't alone. This happened about a year ago, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I thought I'd share the story, maybe get some thoughts on it. So my partner and I were looking to take a little weekend getaway, something low-key and relaxing. We're both based in Detroit, and we wanted to get out of the city for a few days. After some searching, we found this historic house listed on Airbnb in a small town near Saugatuck, Michigan. The house looked perfect in the pictures. Old, with that classic, charming Victorian style, lots of character. The reviews were all positive, too. People praising how unique and peaceful it was. We were sold. We booked it for a Friday to Sunday stay, and the host seemed friendly in the messages, saying they'd be available if we needed anything. We drove up on a Friday afternoon. The house was about a 3-hour drive from Detroit, tucked away in this quiet neighborhood surrounded by trees. When we arrived, it was exactly like the photos, maybe even nicer. It was this big, beautiful 2-story house with a wraparound porch, big windows, and a lot of original features. It had that creaky, old house vibe, but in a good way, at least at first. The host greeted us when we got there. He was polite, gave us a quick tour of the place, and went over the basics like where the towels were, how to work the old heating system, that kind of stuff. Then he mentioned that one room on the second floor was off limits because it was being renovated. He said it casually, and we didn't think much of it at the time. The rest of the house was available for us to use, so it didn't seem like a big deal. After he left, we unpacked, settled in, and just enjoyed being out of the city. The house had a cozy living room with a fireplace, and we spent most of the evening there, drinking wine and talking. It felt nice to be disconnected for a bit. But that night, something strange happened. We were getting ready for bed, and I heard what sounded like a creak coming from upstairs. It wasn't that unusual because, like I said, it was an old house. Old houses make noise, right? I figured it was just the floorboards settling or something. But as I lay in bed, I kept hearing these faint noises from upstairs. Footsteps. Not loud, but distinct. It was strange because we were the only ones there. And the only other room upstairs was that off-limits room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing these soft, almost deliberate-sounding creaks, like someone was moving around up there. At one point, I got up to check it out. I walked up the narrow staircase, the wood creaking under my feet with each step. The hallway was dark, and the door to the off-limits room was at the far end. I walked slowly, half expecting to hear something or see someone, but when I got to the door, everything was quiet. There was nothing unusual, just the closed door. I stood there for a minute listening, but heard nothing, so I went back to bed. The next morning, we talked about it over breakfast. My partner said they heard the noises too, but they agreed it was probably just the house being old and settling. Still, it made me feel uneasy, especially since the sounds seemed to come from that one room that we weren't supposed to go into. The day went by fine. We went out to explore the nearby town, grabbed lunch, and spent some time at the beach since Saugatuck is close to Lake Michigan. By the time we got back to the house, it was late afternoon. We cooked dinner, and again, things felt normal for a while. But as it got dark, that uneasy feeling crept back. Around 10 p.m., we were in the living room when the power flickered. It was brief, maybe a second or two, but it was enough to make me jump. We looked at each other, wondering if it was just a random outage. The lights came back on, so we shrugged it off. About an hour later, we decided to head to bed. I'd almost forgotten about the noises from the night before until I walked past the staircase leading to the second floor. I glanced up. and something about it just felt wrong. The darkness at the top of the stairs seemed heavier, like something was waiting up there. I didn't say anything, but I think my partner sensed it too, because we both seemed to get quiet as we headed to bed. That night, the noises started again. But this time, they were louder. I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps pacing slowly, back and forth. The sounds were coming from the direction of the off-limits room. It was unnerving, but again I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was an animal up there. Maybe it was the wind causing something to move. But then I remembered that the room was supposed to be locked. The footsteps stopped for a while and I managed to doze off, but around 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of a door creaking open. It wasn't our door. It sounded like it was coming from upstairs. I lay there, frozen, listening. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to check. I just stayed still, hoping it was my imagination. But then, I heard soft footsteps again, this time descending the stairs. They were slow, almost careful, as if someone was trying not to make too much noise. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake my partner, but they were still asleep. I lay there, listening as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't see the staircase from where I was in bed, but I could picture it in my head, the way it curved down into the hallway. The footsteps stopped. Everything was silent. I was too terrified to move, to breathe, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, and I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I didn't say anything to my partner about what I heard. I didn't want to freak them out, and besides, it could have been anything, right? Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. We had one more night left, and I didn't want to ruin the trip. That day, we stayed out longer, exploring more of the town, but the whole time I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, wondering if I had imagined them. Part of me wanted to leave early, but I didn't want to admit that I was scared. When we got back to the house that evening, everything felt off. I can't explain it exactly, but there was this heaviness in the air. We made dinner, but neither of us was really talking. The house felt different, like it wasn't just ours anymore. After dinner, we sat in the living room, watching a movie, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the staircase, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, my partner suggested we head to bed, but I wasn't ready to sleep. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like if I went to bed, something bad would happen. We went upstairs and I got ready for bed, but instead of lying down, I found myself walking back toward the staircase, almost like I was drawn to it. I stood at the bottom, looking up at the dark landing. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was watching me from the top of the stairs. I went back to the bedroom, trying to shake the feeling, and crawled into bed. The house was dead silent. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, but at some point I heard the sound again. The door to the off-limits room was creaking open. This time, I was sure of it. The footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, just like the night before. But instead of stopping at the top of the stairs, they began to descend. My heart was racing as I heard the footsteps getting closer. I couldn't bring myself to move, to check, to do anything. I just lay there, paralyzed, listening as they reached the bottom of the stairs. And then nothing. I didn't hear anything else. The footsteps didn't come down the hallway. They didn't retreat back upstairs. It was just silence, thick and suffocating. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the house was completely still. When morning finally came, I didn't even bother trying to act like everything was okay. I woke up my partner and we packed up as quickly as we could. Neither of us said much. We just wanted to get out of there. As we were leaving, I glanced up at the second-floor windows. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind one of them, but I quickly looked away. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to leave. We drove back to Detroit in silence, both of us too unsettled to talk about what had happened. When we got home, I started looking up reviews of the house, wondering if anyone else had experienced anything weird. But all the reviews were normal. People talking about how beautiful and peaceful it was, how much they enjoyed their stay. No one mentioned anything about strange noises or footsteps in the night. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to make sense of it. Maybe there was someone else in the house with us the whole time, someone the host didn't tell us about. Or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, fueled by the isolation and the eerie atmosphere of the old house. But the thing that sticks with me, the thing I can't shake, is the sound of that door creaking open in the middle of the night, and the footsteps that followed, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was making sure I knew they were there. We haven't rented another Airbnb since then, and I don't think I ever want to stay in an old remote house like that again. Something about that place wasn't right, and I don't think I'll ever really know what happened there. We stayed at a countryside villa, but the host's brother kept appearing, and it still haunts me. Last summer, a group of friends and I decided to rent a villa for a week-long vacation. We're all from Chicago, and we wanted to get away from the city for a while. So we found this beautiful countryside villa on Airbnb in a rural area outside of Traverse City, Michigan. The place looked amazing in the photos. Huge property, surrounded by trees, with a pool and everything. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind and relax for a week. There were 5 of us going. Me, my friend Sarah, who handled most of the booking stuff, her boyfriend, another friend of ours, and her fiancé. We were excited because it had been a while since we all got together for something like this. And we were looking forward to a chill week with just us. Some good food, drinks, and the peace of the countryside. The host messaged Sarah a few times leading up to the trip, making sure we had all the information we needed. Everything seemed normal, and the host was super friendly in the messages, talking about how quiet and peaceful the property was. She did mention that her brother lived on the property, in a smaller cottage off to the side, but she assured us that he kept to himself and wouldn't bother us. I don't think any of us thought much of it at the time. We figured, okay, he lives nearby, no big deal. We weren't planning on causing any trouble anyway. We got to the villa on a Saturday afternoon. The drive up was beautiful, and when we pulled into the driveway, the place was even nicer than the pictures. It was this big old farmhouse-style villa with lots of character, surrounded by thick woods and rolling hills. The host met us when we arrived, gave us a quick tour, and handed over the keys. She was friendly, seemed down to earth, and reminded us again that her brother was staying in the cottage off to the side of the property. She pointed it out. It was set back a bit, tucked behind some trees. You couldn't see it from the main house, which was kind of a relief. We figured he'd be out of sight, out of mind. That first day and night were great. We settled in, grilled some dinner outside, and hung out by the pool until it got dark. The area was so quiet, and you could see a million stars in the sky. It felt like we were a million miles away from everything. We stayed up late, talking and laughing, and by the time we all went to bed, I felt like this was going to be the perfect getaway. But on the second day, things started getting weird. It was late afternoon, and we were all hanging out by the pool again, Sarah was floating on a raft, her boyfriend was grilling, and the rest of us were just lounging around. I happened to look over toward the tree line near the edge of the property, and that's when I saw him, the host's brother. He was standing just at the edge of the trees, not moving, just watching us. He was a little far away, so I couldn't see his face very well, but he was definitely standing there, staring. I nudged Sarah and pointed him out. She waved kind of awkwardly, but he didn't wave back. He just turned and disappeared into the woods. We all kind of laughed it off, figuring he was just curious about who was staying on the property, or maybe he was just taking a walk. Still, it was a little strange, especially since the host had assured us that he'd stay out of our way. That evening, we sat down for dinner inside the villa, and I couldn't stop thinking about the guy just standing there earlier. I joked with the group that he was probably some hermit who hadn't seen people in a while, but underneath the joke, I was starting to feel a little uneasy about it. We didn't talk about it much, though, and after dinner, we decided to go for a walk around the property. We walked along the edge of the woods where I'd seen him earlier. It was a little creepy just because the trees were so thick and dark, but the path was well worn and we stayed pretty close to the house. We didn't see him or anything else weird, and we eventually made our way back to the villa. As the night went on, I kind of forgot about it. That night, though, I woke up around 2 a.m. I don't know why. I wasn't having a nightmare or anything, but I just suddenly woke up, feeling wide awake. I lay there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. And that's when I noticed something outside the window. The bedroom I was in was on the second floor, and it had a big window that looked out over the front yard. The moon was out, so there was enough light for me to see a bit of the yard. And that's when I saw him again. The host's brother standing just beyond the driveway, near the tree line, looking up at the house. I froze. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring up at the house. I didn't know if he could see me or if he was just staring at the house in general. But something about the way he was standing there freaked me out. I watched him for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a minute or two. Finally, he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I lay there, my heart pounding, wondering what the hell that was about. I didn't want to wake anyone up, so I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm myself down. I told myself he was probably just walking around, maybe checking the property or something, but it didn't make sense. Why would he be out there in the middle of the night, just standing around? The next morning, I told Sarah about it, and she looked just as creeped out as I felt. We told the others, and everyone kind of agreed that it was weird, but no one seemed to want to make a big deal out of it. We were all trying to have a good time, and we didn't want to let something like that ruin the trip. But over the next few days, the brother kept appearing. We'd see him at random times, always standing at the edge of the property, never coming too close, but always there, watching. He never waved, never said anything, just stood there. One time, we were inside playing a board game, and I glanced out the window and saw him standing just outside the tree line, staring in through the window. I pointed it out to the group and we all looked, but as soon as he realized we'd seen him, he turned and walked away. It became this weird, unspoken thing between us. No one wanted to talk about it too much, but we were all on edge. The villa was beautiful, and we were trying to enjoy our time there, but every time he appeared, it made things feel wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. On the fourth night, things escalated. We had stayed up late, drinking and playing cards. Everyone eventually went to bed, but I was still feeling restless, so I stayed up a little longer, sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone. It was quiet, and I felt like I was finally starting to relax, but then I heard a noise from the hallway. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but I knew everyone was asleep. I got up and walked toward the hallway, my heart racing. The lights were off, but there was enough moonlight coming in through the windows to see. I stood there, listening, trying to figure out what I'd heard, but everything was quiet again. I told myself it was probably just the house settling or maybe one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement at the end of the hallway. It was him, the brother. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, just outside the door to one of the bedrooms. My heart nearly stopped. He hadn't made a sound. He was just standing there, staring into the room where one of my friends was sleeping. I didn't know what to do. I felt frozen. Should I yell? Should I confront him? But before I could do anything, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the stairs. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened before finally snapping out of it. I rushed to wake up Sarah and the others, telling them what I'd seen. Everyone was freaked out at that point, and we all agreed that we needed to leave. It was 3 a.m., but we packed up as quickly as we could, throwing our stuff into bags and getting out of the house. We didn't bother cleaning up or checking out properly. We just wanted to leave. As we were loading the car, I looked back toward the trees, and there he was, standing just beyond the driveway again, watching us. He didn't move, didn't come any closer, just stood there, like he was making sure we were leaving. We drove back to Chicago in almost complete silence. No one wanted to talk about it, and honestly, I think we were all too freaked out to even process what had happened. When we got home, we messaged the host, telling her we'd left early and explaining what had happened with her brother. She apologized, saying he had some issues but insisted he wouldn't have hurt anyone. That didn't make us feel any better. My friend disappeared during a stay at a shared house, and I still don't know what happened. This happened a couple of years ago, and it still messes with my head. I've tried to forget about it, but the more I think about it, the more unsettled I get. It was supposed to be a fun weekend trip, but things took a dark turn, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that I missed something critical. I thought maybe writing it out would help. Back in 2021, my best friend and I decided to do a weekend getaway. We were both living in Cleveland at the time and just wanted a quick escape from our routines. He found this shared house rental near Akron on Airbnb that was super cheap. The listing said the host lived in a separate part of the house, but we'd have private rooms and free access to the kitchen and living areas. It sounded like a solid deal, close enough to the city that we wouldn't be totally isolated, but quiet enough for a low-key weekend. We booked it for 2 nights. The house was in a small town called Copley, just a short drive from Akron. The area was quiet, mostly residential, with a lot of trees and narrow roads. When we pulled up, the house looked pretty standard. 2 stories, kind of run down, but not in a creepy way. Just old. The host was a guy in his mid-40s maybe. He seemed normal enough when we first met him, although a little standoffish. He showed us to our rooms, which were across the hall from each other on the 2nd floor, and then left us alone. He didn't say much beyond the basics of how to lock the doors, and that we could text him if we needed anything. Our rooms were small but clean, and the whole house had this kind of outdated vibe. Faded wallpaper, old furniture that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. It was clear the guy wasn't really investing much into the property, but it wasn't a dump either. It was fine for a weekend. The first night was totally uneventful. We went out to grab some food, came back, hung out in the shared living room for a bit, and then called it a night. Everything was quiet. I slept pretty well. And when I woke up the next morning, I felt good about the trip. My friend was still asleep, so I went downstairs to make coffee. I noticed the host's door was shut, so I assumed he was still asleep too. I grabbed my coffee, headed back to my room, and started scrolling through my phone while waiting for my friend to wake up. After about an hour, I realized he hadn't come out of his room yet, which was kind of weird because he's usually up early. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time, and still nothing. I figured maybe he was still out cold, so I let it go and went back downstairs to hang out for a bit. Another hour passed, and he still hadn't come down. That's when I started getting a little concerned. I went back upstairs and knocked on his door again, but there was no response. This time I tried the handle, but the door was locked. That wasn't unusual, though. We always locked our doors out of habit, especially in a shared space like that. I texted him to see if maybe he'd gone out for a walk or something, but his phone pinged from inside his room. I could hear it buzzing through the door. That's when I started to feel uneasy. His phone, his stuff, everything was still in his room, but he wasn't answering. I went back downstairs and knocked on the host's door to see if maybe he'd seen my friend leave or something. The host answered the door, looking half asleep. He said he hadn't seen or heard anything, which didn't help me feel any better. I went back upstairs and stood outside my friend's door for a while, unsure of what to do next. I didn't want to overreact, but something didn't feel right. By early afternoon, I still hadn't seen or heard from him. His door remained locked, and he wasn't responding to texts or knocks. I started to wonder if maybe he'd left the house somehow without telling me, but I didn't understand why he'd leave his phone and all his stuff behind. The weirdest part was that the house was quiet. There was no sign that he'd gotten up or moved around at all that morning. I asked the host again if he'd heard anything, and he just shrugged, looking mildly annoyed that I was even asking. He told me I could contact the Airbnb customer service if I was worried, which felt like a brush off, but at that point I wasn't sure what else to do. So I did just that. I contacted Airbnb support and explained the situation. They told me to try calling my friend again, and if I couldn't get in touch with him, to consider contacting local authorities. By the time evening rolled around and I still hadn't heard anything, I was freaking out. I ended up calling the local police. I felt kind of ridiculous doing it, but I didn't know what else to do. They showed up and took my statement, asking the usual questions. When was the last time I saw him? Did he have any reason to leave without telling me, that sort of thing? The cops knocked on his door too, but when there was no answer, they didn't force it open or anything. They said they couldn't break down the door without evidence of a crime or emergency. The host, when questioned by the police, was weirdly calm. He reiterated that he hadn't seen my friend and that he'd been in his part of the house most of the day. He didn't seem concerned at all, which bugged me. But the police didn't find anything suspicious at that point, and they left after advising me to keep trying to reach him. That night was the worst. I couldn't sleep, and I didn't know what to do next. My friend's room was still locked, and I kept thinking maybe he'd open the door at any moment, that he'd just been sleeping or needed space. But it didn't make sense. Why would he ignore my texts and leave all his things behind? I kept running through the possibilities in my head, but nothing added up. The next morning, I tried again. I knocked, texted, called his phone, nothing. The host was keeping his distance now, acting like he didn't want to get involved, and it made me even more anxious. I eventually called the police again and told them that something was definitely wrong. This time they came back with more urgency. They brought a locksmith to open my friend's door. When they got the door open, my stomach dropped. The room was empty. All of his stuff was still there. his phone, his wallet, his clothes, but there was no sign of him. The bed looked like it hadn't even been slept in. There were no windows in the room, so it wasn't like he could have climbed out. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but there was no trace of him anywhere. At that point, the whole situation escalated. They started treating it like a missing person case, and they questioned the host again, more aggressively this time. But the host stuck to his story. He hadn't seen or heard anything, and he had no idea what happened to my friend. The police searched the host's part of the house, but they didn't find anything suspicious. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was living through a nightmare. I had to stay in town for a few days while the investigation continued. The police brought in more people to search the area, combing through nearby woods and fields, but they didn't find anything. No one saw him leave, there were no security cameras in the area, and the roads around the house were quiet. It was like he just disappeared without a trace. Eventually, I had to go back to Cleveland. There was nothing more I could do, and the police assured me they would keep me updated if they found anything. I didn't want to leave, but I felt completely helpless. Days turned into weeks, and there were still no leads. My friend was just gone. I spent a lot of time thinking about what could have happened. Did he leave in the middle of the night for some reason? Was he lured out of the house by someone? I couldn't stop thinking about the host and how strangely calm he had been throughout the whole thing. It felt like he knew something he wasn't telling us, but the police couldn't find any evidence to link him to the disappearance. The whole experience has left me with more questions than answers. I've gone over every detail in my head a million times, trying to figure out if I missed something, if there was a clue I didn't pick up on. But no matter how hard I think about it, I can't explain what happened to my friend. It's like he just vanished into thin air, and the not knowing is the worst part. The police kept in touch for a while, but eventually the updates stopped. The case went cold. I still don't know what happened to my friend, and I don't know if I ever will. I haven't used Airbnb since then. We found a hidden notebook with disturbing details about us during an Airbnb stay. My girlfriend and I were living in Columbus, Ohio at the time, and we both had stressful jobs, so we liked to take little weekend trips to relax and unwind. Nothing fancy, just small, quiet places to get away from everything for a couple of days. We usually booked places in the middle of nowhere to make sure we could fully disconnect and recharge. One weekend, we decided to book an Airbnb in a small town called Yellow Springs, not too far from Dayton. It's a quaint little town with a lot of hiking trails and cool shops, and we'd been there before for day trips, but this time we wanted to stay overnight. We found a cozy-looking house listed on Airbnb that seemed perfect for a quiet getaway. It was a small, one-story house just outside of town, surrounded by trees. The host's profile had great reviews, people saying they had a wonderful time, that the host was friendly but not intrusive, and that the place was clean and comfortable. The photos showed a rustic, cabin-like interior with lots of wood paneling and large windows that overlooked the woods. It seemed ideal. The booking process was smooth, and the host sent us all the usual details, check-in instructions, how to use the thermostat, where the spare key was hidden, that kind of thing. He seemed friendly in his messages, and everything felt pretty normal leading up to the trip. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, arriving just before sunset. The house was just as described, small but charming, tucked away at the end of a gravel road with no neighbors in sight. We grabbed our bags and headed inside, excited to settle in for a relaxing weekend. The inside of the house was nice enough, although it felt a little more lived in than the photos suggested. It wasn't dirty, but there were small things, like scuff marks on the walls and worn-out furniture, that made it clear this wasn't a professionally managed property. Still, nothing major. It had everything we needed, and the host had left a welcome note with a list of local attractions and restaurants, which was thoughtful. That first night was pretty uneventful. We made dinner, had a couple of drinks, and spent some time talking on the back porch, listening to the sounds of the woods. The house felt quiet and secluded, exactly what we were hoping for. After a while, we decided to head to bed. The bedroom was small but cozy, with a big window that looked out into the trees. We fell asleep pretty quickly. The next morning, we got up and decided to explore the town a bit. We spent the day walking around, checking out a few local shops and grabbing lunch at a small cafe. It was a perfect, laid-back day. And by the time we got back to the house in the late afternoon, we were both feeling really relaxed. After we got back, we lounged around for a bit, scrolling through our phones and reading. My girlfriend was sitting on the bed and I was on the couch in the living room. At some point, she got up to grab something from her bag. And that's when she noticed something weird. Under the bed, tucked far back against the wall, was a small notebook. She called me into the room, and we both looked at it for a second, wondering why it was there. It wasn't ours, and we hadn't noticed it the night before. At first, we thought maybe the cleaning staff had missed it, or it was left behind by a previous guest. Curious, we pulled it out and flipped through it. The first few pages seemed like someone's random notes, nothing unusual. But then, as we kept flipping, we realized that the notes weren't random at all. They were about us. There were detailed entries about what we had done since we arrived. It listed things like the time we'd checked in, what we'd talked about on the porch the night before, and even a note about how many drinks we'd had. It was eerie how specific the details were. It mentioned what we were wearing, the fact that we'd gone into town for lunch, and even referenced a joke I'd made that afternoon. I felt my stomach drop as we read through the pages. There was no way anyone could have known all of this unless they'd been watching us the entire time. We both started to feel uneasy, trying to make sense of it. At first, we thought maybe it was a prank or something left behind by a previous guest who was messing around. But the details were too accurate, too recent. We kept flipping through the notebook, and that's when things got even more disturbing. Toward the back, there were photographs, printed small photos that had been stapled to the pages. They were pictures of us, sitting on the back porch, walking through the living room, sitting on the couch, all taken from different angles, clearly from inside the house. The most recent photo was of us from earlier that day, sitting in the bedroom right before we found the notebook. At that point, panic started to set in. We couldn't figure out how someone had been taking these pictures without us noticing. The house didn't seem to have any obvious cameras, and we hadn't seen anyone around the property. We immediately started searching the place, looking for hidden cameras or anything that might explain how someone was watching us. But after checking every corner, every vent, and every possible hiding spot, we came up empty. We were both freaked out and didn't know what to do next. It didn't feel right to stay there, but at the same time, we didn't have anywhere else to go that night. It was getting dark, and we didn't want to drive all the way back home in the middle of the night, especially since we'd had a couple of drinks with dinner. We talked about calling the host, but something about that felt off. The host had been so friendly in the messages, but now, knowing that someone had been keeping such close tabs on us, we didn't trust him. Instead, we locked the doors, closed the curtains, and decided to stick it out for one more night, keeping the lights on and trying to stay calm. We agreed to leave first thing in the morning. Neither of us slept well that night. Every sound in the house felt amplified, every creak or groan of the wood making us jump. I kept expecting someone to knock on the door or worse, come in uninvited. When the morning finally came, we packed up as fast as we could and got out of there. As we were loading the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I glanced around the property, half expecting to see someone standing in the woods or watching from one of the windows, but there was no one in sight. We drove back to Columbus in almost complete silence. Both of us were on edge, trying to process what had happened. When we got home, we sat down and talked about whether or not to report it to Airbnb or the police. We still didn't know for sure who had been watching us or how they'd been doing it. There were no obvious signs of surveillance in the house, and the photos in the notebook were the only evidence we had. In the end, we decided to report the incident to Airbnb. Airbnb's response was frustrating, to say the least. They sent back a generic message thanking us for the feedback and said they would look into the matter. We never heard anything else from them. We never got a follow-up or any explanation about what had happened or whether the host was investigated. The listing eventually disappeared from the site, but we never found out if that was because of our complaint or if the host just took it down. The whole experience left us both feeling violated and paranoid. It's been a long time since that trip, but it still bothers me. I can't stop thinking about who was watching us and why. Was it the host? Was it someone else with access to the house? And why go to the trouble of documenting everything in that notebook? We haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. The idea of being in someone else's space, knowing that we could be watched without our knowledge, just feels too risky now. I've become a lot more cautious about privacy and security whenever we travel. It's hard to shake the sense that no matter where you are, someone could be watching. I got trapped in a bathroom while staying at a beach house, and I genuinely thought no one would find me. This happened about a year ago, and it still makes me feel uneasy whenever I think about it. I was on a solo vacation, staying at a quiet beachfront cottage in a small town on the coast of North Carolina. I had planned the trip as a way to disconnect and relax, get away from my job and the stress of city life. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, the beach, and some good books. I found this small beach house on Airbnb, located a little outside of Beaufort, North Carolina. The listing described it as a charming, quiet spot with a view of the ocean. It was perfect for what I needed. Simple, no frills, just a place where I could unwind for a week. The reviews were good, and the photos showed a cozy little place with a deck overlooking the beach. It looked exactly like the kind of low-key getaway I had in mind. I booked it for 5 days. The place was a bit more secluded than I initially expected, which was fine with me. It was about a 15-minute drive from town, down a narrow, winding road with only a few other houses scattered along the way. The beach was just a short walk away, and there weren't many people around. That part felt like a dream. Having the beach almost entirely to myself was something I hadn't experienced before. I was ready to spend a few days just relaxing, reading, and enjoying the quiet. The house itself was older, but it had been well maintained. The host had left a key in a lockbox by the door, and the check-in process was smooth. Inside, it had that kind of old beach house vibe. Wooden floors, simple furniture, a bit of a musty smell like it had been closed up for a while, but nothing too off-putting. The place had everything I needed, and I spent the first couple of days just lounging around, walking along the beach, and making simple meals in the small kitchen. The first 2 days were uneventful, exactly what I'd hoped for. I felt like I was finally starting to relax after months of being stuck in the grind of work. The sound of the ocean was always in the background, and the breeze from the water kept the house cool, even though it was the middle of summer. It was one of those places where you could easily lose track of time, which is what I wanted. On the third day, things took a turn. I woke up that morning and decided to take a long walk down the beach before it got too hot. I spent a couple of hours wandering along the shore, enjoying the solitude. By the time I got back to the house, it was around noon, and the sun was blazing. I was sweaty and sandy, so I decided to take a shower. The bathroom in the house was small and a little cramped. It had an old, slightly rusted shower head and a tiny window that didn't really open. The door was one of those cheap, hollow wooden ones with a basic lock on the inside. Nothing fancy, but it worked fine for a vacation rental. After my shower, I went to open the door to leave the bathroom and the handle wouldn't turn. At first, I thought maybe it was just stuck, so I jiggled it a little, but it didn't budge. I tried turning it the other way, thinking maybe I'd accidentally locked it, but again, nothing happened. The handle just spun loosely in my hand, not catching on anything. I stood there for a second, not really panicking, but definitely confused. I figured maybe the door had swollen from the humidity, something that happens in old houses sometimes. I pulled on it harder, then pushed, but it still wouldn't open. That's when I realized the door wasn't just stuck. The handle was completely broken. I was locked inside. I tried to stay calm. I thought, okay, this is annoying, but it's not the end of the world. I'll just call the host, or maybe even a locksmith to come help me out. But then I remembered that there was no cell service in the house. One of the reasons I'd picked this place was because it was so remote, and I'd figured that being disconnected from my phone for a few days would be a good thing. Now it felt like a huge mistake. There was no landline phone in the house either, something I hadn't thought much about when I checked in. I had been relying entirely on my phone for communication, but with no signal, I had no way of calling anyone for help. I started to get a little more anxious. I figured there had to be a way to get the door open, even if it was just by brute force. I tried kicking it, slamming my shoulder against it, but it didn't budge. It was an old door, but it was solid enough to keep me trapped. The worst part was that there were no windows in the bathroom that I could use to get out. The tiny one above the shower was too small for anyone to fit through, and even if I could open it, it didn't lead anywhere useful, just a narrow view of the side of the house. By this point, I'd been stuck in there for over an hour, and the heat was starting to get to me. The bathroom had no ventilation, and the sun was beating down on the house, turning it into an oven. I started to feel lightheaded, and the walls of the small bathroom felt like they were closing in on me. I sat down on the floor for a minute, trying to think through my options. I thought about breaking the door down, but I wasn't sure how much force it would take, and I didn't want to injure myself in the process. I didn't have any tools or anything in the bathroom that I could use to take the door apart. My mind raced through different possibilities. Maybe I could shout for help, but I hadn't seen anyone nearby the entire time I'd been there. The other houses were too far away, and I doubted anyone would hear me over the sound of the ocean. As the afternoon dragged on, I started to get more desperate. I kept trying the door, pulling and pushing on it, but it wouldn't budge. The handle just spun uselessly in my hand, taunting me. My throat was dry, and I realized I hadn't brought any water into the bathroom with me. The heat was making me feel sick, and I started to panic at the thought of being stuck in there for hours or even days before anyone found me. At one point, I started banging on the door with my fists, hoping that somehow someone would hear me. I knew it was pointless, but I was too frustrated and scared to think clearly. I must have spent a solid 10 minutes just hitting the door, shouting at it, trying to force it open, but it didn't make a difference. I slumped down on the floor again, trying to calm myself down. I thought about what my options were. maybe I could try breaking off the handle completely and seeing if I could manipulate the mechanism inside. But I had no tools, no way to take the door apart. And every time I looked at the handle, I felt more hopeless. The hours dragged on. I kept trying to open the door every now and then, just out of desperation, but nothing changed. The air in the bathroom was stifling, and I started to feel dizzy from the heat and dehydration. I could hear the faint sound of the ocean outside, mocking me. I was so close to being free, but completely trapped at the same time. By the time the sun started to go down, I was completely exhausted. I'd spent the entire day trying to get out, but nothing had worked. My muscles were sore from throwing myself against the door, and I had a pounding headache from the heat. I realized I needed to conserve my energy, so I stopped fighting the door and just sat on the floor, waiting. I kept telling myself that someone would eventually come. The host would check on the house, or maybe a neighbor would notice something was off. But I knew that could take days. I had told the host I didn't need anything and to leave me alone for the rest of the week. I hadn't seen another person the entire time I'd been there, and I had no idea how often anyone came to check on the property. Night fell, and the temperature in the bathroom finally started to drop. I felt a small sense of relief as the cool air replaced the suffocating heat, but the darkness brought a new level of fear. I couldn't see anything in the pitch-black room except for the faint light coming from under the door. My phone was still in the bedroom, useless without a signal anyway. I sat in the dark, feeling completely helpless. At some point during the night, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. It was early morning, and the light was starting to filter through the small bathroom window. My throat was painfully dry, and I felt weak and nauseous. I knew I couldn't stay in there much longer without water or food. I had to get out. With whatever strength I had left, I threw myself against the door one more time. I rammed my shoulder into it as hard as I could again and again, until finally, with a loud crack, the door frame splintered and the door popped open. I stumbled out of the bathroom, barely able to stand. I grabbed the nearest bottle of water I could find and downed it in seconds, trying to steady myself. My body felt weak, but the overwhelming relief of being out of that tiny, suffocating room was almost enough to make me cry. I packed up my things as fast as I could, barely able to think straight. I didn't even bother cleaning up or leaving a note for the host. I just wanted to get out of there. As soon as I was packed, I jumped in my car and drove back to civilization, my heart still racing. I've thought about that experience a lot since then. I still can't believe how quickly a peaceful getaway turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The thought of being trapped like that with no way to call for help still haunts me. It made me realize how vulnerable we can be, especially when we're isolated like that. Needless to say, I'm a lot more careful about where I stay now. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.